It started as a typical morning, the sun creeping through the curtains and the scent of freshly brewed coffee wafting through the air. But for me, nothing about that day would be ordinary. As I stood outside, watering my mom's cherished rose garden, I heard the unmistakable sound of gravel crunching under tires. It was Karen, the HOA president, the woman who seemed to live and breathe the neighborhood's rules, a woman whose name alone caused a pit to form in my stomach. Her sleek black SUV pulled up to our driveway, the engine humming with a quiet arrogance that matched her own. I felt my heartbeat quicken. Every time Karen visited, something unpleasant followed. I hadn't seen her in a week, but I knew it wouldn't be a social call. She was here to demand compliance, to enforce the unwritten law that she had somehow become the self-appointed enforcer of. She rolled down her window, the air between us thick with unspoken expectations. "Alex, those garden gnomes have got to go. They violate Section 8, Paragraph 12 of our community guidelines," Karen said, her voice dripping with a mixture of feigned politeness and the kind of authority only someone like her would have. I stared at her, trying to keep my composure. The gnomes were more than just decoration. Each one represented a memory with my dad, who had passed away years ago. Every year, he had gifted Mom a new one for her birthday, and now Karen wanted to take those memories from us. "Karen, those gnomes have been here for 7 years. My dad put them here. They're part of our family's history." She waved her hand dismissively. "Rules are rules, Alex. The board insists they're removed by Friday, or it's a $200 fine per gnome." I swallowed hard. $1,600 in fines for something that meant the world to us. Mom was already struggling, physically and emotionally, with her health. The last thing she needed was this constant stress, these never-ending violations from Karen and her HOA cronies. But it wasn't just the gnomes. I had been doing everything I could to take care of Mom's needs, helping her through dizziness, nausea, and confusion that seemed to worsen with each passing day. I tried to put the gnome incident out of my mind, but deep down, I knew Karen wasn't going to stop with that. She wanted more. By Friday, Karen's threats had come to life in the form of fines, penalties, and more violations that seemed to pile up faster than I could handle. It wasn't long before I started wondering if these violations were part of a larger scheme, a more sinister plan to force us out of our home. Karen's latest rule enforcement was just the beginning of something much darker. What I didn't know at the time was that her harassment would soon escalate to a level far beyond garden gnomes and mailbox colors. And when I discovered what she had been doing, what she had been trying to cover up, it would change everything. One evening, as I was taking out the trash, I saw Doug Thompson, Karen's husband, standing near our water meter. His actions were odd, no dog in sight, no real reason for him to be there. But I noticed something out of place. The ground around our water meter had been disturbed, and a small, unmistakable drop of blue liquid had settled on some nearby rocks. That moment, small as it seemed, sent a chill down my spine. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Something had changed in our water supply, and that suspicion grew stronger the more I saw the symptoms in Mom. Nausea, dizziness. Her condition was deteriorating fast. When the hospital ran tests, the results were inconclusive, but I couldn't ignore the nagging thought that her health problems were not coincidental. The tipping point came when I installed a security camera to monitor the water meter. What I captured on film that night would be the catalyst for everything that followed. There, on the footage, was Doug Thompson, pouring something from a small bottle into our water line, all while Karen kept watch. The connection between her harassment and Mom's illness became clear. This wasn't just a vendetta. It was an orchestrated attempt to force us out of our home. In that moment, everything changed. I wasn't just protecting my mom anymore. I was taking back control. I was going to make sure Karen and the HOA president would pay for what they'd done. But how could I make them pay in a way that would make them regret ever messing with my family? It wasn't just about fighting back. It was about outsmarting them. And I had a plan. It was time to turn the tables in a way that would leave them speechless. The plan unfolds, taking action. I wasn't going to just sit back and wait for Karen to drive me to the edge. It was time to take control, and I wasn't going to use conventional methods. I had to get creative. I thought back to the days when my father had shared his wisdom with me. One thing he always said stuck with me. If you want to win, sometimes you have to play the game smarter than everyone else. I started thinking about our water supply, the one thing that kept our home alive. If Karen was poisoning it, if she was slowly making my mother sick, then maybe I could turn the tables. Maybe I could use her own tactics against her, but in a way that would outsmart her and make her regret ever crossing me. And that's when it hit me. Water rights. It was something I hadn't thought about until a casual conversation with my neighbor, Elaine. She told me about the neighborhood's strange water setup. It wasn't managed by the city. No, Pinecrest Gardens water was controlled by a private company, Clearwater LLC. I felt a spark of realization ignite inside me. What if I could buy Clearwater LLC? The thought felt absurd at first. Could I really own a company that controlled the water supply for hundreds of homes? But the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. If I could control the water supply, I could ensure that Karen and her cronies would have to play by my rules. The next day, I set out to learn everything I could about Clearwater LLC. I spent hours poring over business records, bankruptcy filings, and city documents. It wasn't just about the water. It was about the power I could hold in my hands if I succeeded. I found out that Clearwater LLC was facing bankruptcy and had been selling off assets to cover its debts. The company owned the water rights to not only Pinecrest Gardens but 2 other neighborhoods. This was my chance. My college friend Jamie, now an environmental lawyer, didn't hesitate when I called her. She'd always been the one to think outside the box, and I needed her insight. After a long conversation, Jamie confirmed that I could indeed purchase the company, especially in its bankruptcy state. She warned me, though, that it would take everything I had to secure it. My savings, my 401k, even taking out a loan. But the anger I felt, the raw emotion from watching my mother suffer, drowned out any hesitation. I told myself, what's money compared to Mom's life? By the end of the day, I made the decision. I emptied my savings account, took out a loan, and pulled from my 401k, leaving me financially stretched thin, but with a clear goal in mind, to gain control of Clearwater LLC. The day that changed everything. The following week, after a series of grueling phone calls, I got the news. The offer had been accepted. I was officially the owner of Clearwater LLC. Now I held the power to control Pinecrest Gardens' water supply, but more importantly, I could hold it hostage if needed. I wasn't going to just roll over and let Karen have her way. I was going to make her feel the consequences of her actions. But I knew that acquiring the company wasn't enough. I had to be strategic. I needed to take action quickly, before Karen had the chance to respond. I had to use this new power wisely, and I had to get back at her in a way that would ensure she never messed with my family again. I created an official letter to the HOA board, stating that effective immediately, I was raising water rates for all residents by 400%. The neighborhood would feel the consequences of Karen's actions in a way that would hit her right where it hurt, in her pocket. This wasn't just a petty revenge. It was a calculated move designed to make Karen understand that there were consequences for poisoning people's lives. The response from Karen and the HOA board was predictable. They were furious, of course. How dare I take control of their water supply? How dare I change the game in such a drastic way? But that was the point. I wasn't just fighting Karen anymore. I was fighting a corrupt system that had allowed her to wield too much power for far too long. Confronting the HOA board. The HOA's response didn't take long. The next day, a new voicemail from Malcolm Reed, the HOA treasurer, popped up on my phone. His voice was filled with frustration. Alex, we need to discuss these allegations you're making. The board takes these homeowner disputes seriously. I deleted the message without even listening to the rest of it. I knew what was coming. They weren't concerned about my mother's health. They were concerned about losing control over the neighborhood. Later that afternoon, I was invited to a community meeting. It was the HOA's way of trying to put me in my place, to convince me to back down. Karen, of course, was at the center of it all, stirring the pot with her usual charm. As I walked into the room, I could already feel the eyes on me. Karen's smug smile made my blood boil, but I wasn't backing down. This time, I had the upper hand. As I approached the front of the room, Karen took the microphone. "Here he is," she announced. "The man who thinks he can bankrupt us all over some garden gnomes. The man who's poisoning our neighborhood's future." The crowd murmured, eyes darting from me to Karen, waiting for the drama to unfold. But I didn't flinch. I took the microphone, stepped forward, and calmly began my speech. "I bought Clearwater LLC for one reason and one reason only. My mother has been in the hospital for weeks. 3 separate labs found antifreeze in our water supply. I have video footage of Doug Thompson tampering with our water line while Karen watched." The room was silent. Karen's face went pale as the crowd exchanged glances. Her smile faltered, and I could see the panic creeping into her eyes. She tried to interrupt, but I raised my hand to stop her. "Think about it, Karen. Why would I spend my life savings to buy a water company over garden gnomes?" The crowd wasn't buying her act anymore. One by one, people started to speak up, sharing their own suspicions, their own stories of strange illnesses and unexplained problems with their water. The power of the truth. It was the beginning of the end for Karen Thompson and her twisted grip on the neighborhood. As the chaos in the room grew, I slipped out unnoticed. My next move was already in the works. I knew I had to bring this to a close, and I had just the way to do it. This was no longer just about water, gnomes, or petty HOA rules. This was about taking down an unjust system that had poisoned not only my mother's health but the well-being of an entire community. I had made my move. Karen thought she could play with people's lives and get away with it. But now I controlled the one thing she needed, the water. And I was going to use it to make her and her HOA cronies pay for what they had done. Building to the climax. The next few days felt surreal. With every phone call, every text, every conversation, Karen's world seemed to unravel. The truth was out there now, and it was only a matter of time before her lies caught up with her. The video footage I had shared, the testimonies from neighbors who had been victims of Karen's cruelty, all pointed back to her. But there was one last step I needed to take. In the coming days, I would take Karen down, legally, financially, and publicly, and the neighborhood would finally be rid of her tyrannical rule. The fall of Karen Thompson. Justice prevails. As the days went on, I could feel the pressure building, not just from the HOA, but from the growing anticipation of what was about to unfold. The community's support was growing, and for once, it seemed like I wasn't alone. The chaos of Karen's actions had rippled through the neighborhood, and people who once feared her or simply avoided confrontation were now taking a stand. The whispers of injustice had turned into a roar, and there was no stopping it. Every phone call, every text message, and every interaction I had with the HOA board felt like a countdown. The ball was in my court, and I was ready to play my final move. The community reacts. One of the most powerful moments came when the neighbors started showing their support. It wasn't just about the money or the garden gnomes anymore. It was about what Karen and the HOA had done to my mother and to the rest of the neighborhood. People were angry, and for the first time they were vocal about it. Elaine, my next-door neighbor, had been the first to step up when I needed help. She, along with Mr. Jenkins and a few other neighbors, brought over soup, flowers, and even donations for my mom's medical bills. People who had once feared Karen's wrath were now uniting for a cause bigger than themselves. But more than the material support, it was the moral backing that meant the most. They had seen Karen for what she truly was, a tyrant hiding behind the guise of community service. And now they knew that, if she could do this to my mother, she could do it to anyone. The police get involved. After a few more sleepless nights and continuous research, I was ready. The video evidence, the toxicology reports, and now the support of the entire neighborhood had created an unassailable case. But there was still one final piece of the puzzle: getting Karen and Doug Thompson held accountable for their actions. With my lawyers at the ready, I filed a report with the police and handed over all the evidence I had gathered. Detective Rivera, who had been investigating the case for weeks, confirmed that the video from my cameras, along with the lab results showing ethylene glycol poisoning, was enough to arrest them. Karen had underestimated me. She had underestimated just how far I was willing to go to protect my mother and make sure she paid for the damage she had caused. It wasn't just about getting her out of the neighborhood anymore. It was about holding her accountable. The police arrived at Karen's house early one morning. By the time the sun rose, Doug and Karen were both in handcuffs. The officers didn't seem to care about the drama or the power play that had been happening in our neighborhood. They had their job to do, and now it was time for Karen to face the consequences. The plea deal. Despite their obvious shock, Karen and Doug were quickly processed and charged. The media coverage was massive. HOA horror. Couple poison neighbors' water over disputes splashed across headlines, exposing their criminal actions to the world. But of course, Karen wasn't going down without a fight. Her lawyer argued that the video evidence was tampered with, that the poisoning was coincidental, and that there was no direct link between her actions and my mother's health decline. But the prosecutor wasn't buying it. Karen's arrogance had finally backfired. She'd been trying to play God with people's lives. But now, the law was going to deal with her. When Karen and Doug were offered a plea deal, the terms were not favorable. They could either plead guilty and serve a reduced sentence of 12 years each, or face a much harsher sentence if they went to trial. To everyone's shock, they accepted the plea deal. But this wasn't just about their sentence. It was about what the community was learning, what people like Karen were capable of when left unchecked. The new HOA. With the Thompsons out of the picture, the HOA had no choice but to make drastic changes. The board members who had supported Karen were forced to step down, and a new interim board was formed, composed of neighbors who had witnessed Karen's tyranny firsthand. People like Ted, who had once been afraid of standing up to Karen, were now leading the charge for a better neighborhood. The new board voted unanimously to suspend all fines and violations until a full review of the bylaws could be conducted. I felt a sense of vindication knowing that Karen's hold over the neighborhood was finally over. The power was no longer in her hands. And I wasn't done yet. The power shift. With Karen and Doug out of the way, I turned my attention back to the water rights that I now controlled. The HOA could no longer bully us with fines or threats. I had made sure that water rates would be set fairly, but there was one thing I wanted to do for the people who had supported me. I gave them a break. For the families who had been victims of Karen's previous policies, I implemented a reduced water rate. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about community healing. My decision wasn't based on the hatred of one individual. It was about restoring fairness. I also made a decision that would solidify the power shift. I would allow the residents of Pinecrest Gardens to feel empowered again. No longer would they be subject to the whims of corrupt HOA leadership. They would now have a voice in how their neighborhood was governed. Mom's recovery. As for my mom, she was finally stable enough to come home after weeks in the hospital. It wasn't easy. The damage to her kidneys was severe, and the doctors warned me that she might need a transplant in the future. But she was alive, and that was all that mattered. When she came home, the neighbors had gathered outside, clapping and cheering. They had cleaned our house, filled the fridge, and even put the garden gnomes back in place, now joined by 20 new ones donated by neighbors. It was a beautiful moment of community support, and it made all the difference in the world. The final victory. 2 months later, when the courts finally ruled on Karen and Doug's case, they were sentenced to 12 years in prison each. The sentence wasn't just for the poisoning. It was for everything they had done to the community, for using their position to manipulate and bully people into submission. During the impact statements, my mom spoke directly to them. "I forgive you," she said, her voice steady despite the years of pain. "But I'll never forget." And with that, Karen and Doug's reign was officially over. But the story doesn't end there. I transferred ownership of Clearwater LLC to a community trust, ensuring that the water supply was managed fairly from now on, and any profits would go toward supporting families like mine who had been affected by the Thompsons' actions. The funds would be used to cover medical expenses, and the trust was managed by people who had experienced Karen's cruelty firsthand, people who cared about the community. A new beginning for Pinecrest Gardens. At the ribbon-cutting ceremony for the Helen Morrison Healing Garden, named in honor of my mother, I stood with the community, feeling a sense of peace wash over me. The garden, filled with flowers and yes, garden gnomes, symbolized everything that had been lost and everything we had regained. The old HOA had crumbled, but from the ashes, a new spirit had emerged. As for Karen, she never returned to Pinecrest Gardens. The once feared HOA president, who had thought she could control everything, was now just a distant memory. And as I watched my mother, a woman who had been poisoned and hurt by the very people who should have protected her, stand proudly by my side, I realized that justice had finally been served. It wasn't just about revenge. It was about taking back control and ensuring that people like Karen Thompson never held power over others again. The lesson here? Sometimes, in order to win, you have to fight not just for your family, but for your community too. And when the system fails you, sometimes you have to create your own justice. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more incredible moments of justice, make sure to hit that like button and share this video with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you never miss an epic story like this one. Your support means the world to us. Let's keep spreading the truth and fighting for justice together.